El Tri, Mexico, the next team up in the team profile series, specifically from CONCACAF. Now, Mexico have a pretty admirable statistic here that distinguishes them from the best teams in the world in Argentina, Spain, France. Mexico is one of only 3 countries to advance past the group stages in each of the last 6 consecutive World Cups, dating back to 1994. The only other 2 countries ever to do this are the 2 most successful countries ever, Germany and Brazil. If you put that into context, this is something that separates Mexico from everybody else. And because they share this with only Brazil and Germany, I think is completely barking mad. Mexico are the quintessential round of 16 team, but since 1986, when they last hosted the World Cup, they've not broken into that elusive quinto partido, the 5th game that Mexico always strives to reach in World Cups. And the only 2 times they did so were actually both on home soil in 1970 and 1986, where they went to the quarterfinals in both editions, both of which were their best ever performances in the World Cup. They came the closest they ever came in 2014, when they were leading the Netherlands 1-0 until the 87th minute, where Holland equalized and then scored a winner a few minutes later in stoppage time on a penalty that many feel should not have been called. But in 2014, Mexico came off a disastrous, near calamitous qualifying campaign when they squeaked through to the playoff off of the United States scoring a late goal against Panama on the road. But when Mexico got to the World Cup, they held host nation Brazil to a 0-0 draw, and they finished on top of the group, just behind Brazil, on the same number of points with 7 points, but an inferior goal difference. And I think if a couple of goals had standed in their first match against Cameroon that were not, wrongfully called offside, Mexico could have topped that group on goal difference. And they came very close under El Piojo Miguel Herrera, the dramatic manager on the sidelines, from getting back to the quarterfinals. This time around was the exact opposite. For 2018 qualifying, Mexico actually topped the Hex, get this, for the first time since 1998. You would think Mexico, they're usually, if not almost always, the best team in CONCACAF, but this was the first time since 1998 Mexico had finished at the top of the CONCACAF hexagonal table, and they did it with 6 wins, 3 draws, and 1 loss, totaling 21 points, with their only loss coming on the final match day against Honduras, much to the USA's dismay. Under manager Juan Carlos Osorio, they went to the quarterfinals of the Copa America Centenario in 2016, and they got to the semifinals of the CONCACAF Gold Cup in 2017, where they disappointingly went out to Jamaica, although that was a B-side. They went to the semifinals of the Confederations Cup in Russia, where they topped the group alongside Portugal with 7 points, and went out to Germany, who is one of their group stage opponents this time around. Mexico ultimately finished in 4th place in the Confederations Cup. This time, they have arguably their most difficult group since 2002, with Germany, as I said, Sweden, and South Korea. This will be the first World Cup that Mexico has to deal with 2 European teams since 2002, and this is held on European soil. The defending champions they will take off with in the first match, which will most likely prove to be Mexico's sternest test, before a must-win victory, a must-win fixture over South Korea, closing out the group against Sweden, which will likely be the decisive fixture to determine who comes in the group behind Germany. But even though Mexico topped CONCACAF qualifying this year, a lot of Mexican fans are not very confident. They're really unsatisfied with manager Juan Carlos Osorio. He's sort of referred to as a tinkerer because he never really settles on a defined steady lineup for Mexico. He likes to experiment all the time. And, on several occasions, this has cost Mexico dearly. In the 7-0 drubbing they had at the hands of Chile in the Copa America Centenario. In the Gold Cup, still was a B team, but they should have beaten Jamaica. Should have at least gotten to the final. In all these recent friendlies that they're playing against Wales and Scotland, Mexico have really struggled to put away their chances. I watched the Scotland game the other night. They should have won that match 4-5-0, but they won it by a 1-0 squeaker. Before that was a 0-0 draw with Wales. They had a 1-0 loss to Croatia's B team back in March. So even though Mexico aren't losing, they're having a difficult time scoring goals lately. And Juan Carlos Osorio doesn't have the team figured out yet, and we're only less than 2 weeks away from the World Cup beginning. And that's not good, because it's one thing to, treat your lineups as a sort of Frankenstein lab experiment. But when you do it the way that Juan Carlos Osorio has, and you don't find a starting 11 that you figure out is your best, that's really not good heading into a major tournament when you're going up against the defending champions. And when you're going up against a Swedish team who, a manager in Jan Andersson, one of the more brilliant managers of this tournament, I worry that Juan Carlos Osorio will get out-coached in that final game against Sweden. And this may sound odd, but Mexico usually rises to the occasion against bigger teams in tournaments. I'm not so much worried about how they will match up with Germany as I am how they will close out the group against South Korea and Sweden. Because I could see a scenario where Mexico plays out of their skins, they grab a draw in that opening match, but then Jan Andersson uses Sweden's strengths and outclasses Osorio in that final match, and Mexico, say, drop points to Sweden. Maybe they lose that final match, or they only get a draw against a desperate South Korea team who has to play Germany last. So, psychologically speaking, even though Mexico not only are the better team, but they have better individuals than Sweden and South Korea, I worry about their mental state heading into their last two group games more so than I am against Germany, because Germany, they're going to have to be on their feet. They're going to have to be alert. And even if they don't get a result against Germany in that first match, if they just, lose 2-1, maybe a 1-goal margin, something that is a much improved performance from the 4-1, smacking that they took in the Confederations Cup, then they're in business. They're playing against Mexico and Sweden afterwards, teams that they should at least amass 4 points from, and then they can weather the storm from there. So let's take a look at Mexico's squad very briefly. Goalkeepers Guillermo Ochoa, part of that 2014 side, put on a clinic in that tournament. Jesus Corona, defenders Hugo Ayala, Gallardo, Miguel Ayun, Hector Moreno, Diego Reyes, Carlos Salcedo, Marco Fabian, Andres Guardado, Hector Herrera, Rafael Marquez, this will be his 5th World Cup, I believe, Javier Aquino, Giovanni Dos Santos. A lot of Mexicans don't think he should have been called up. Carlos Vela, Oribe Peralta, Irving Lozano. So you see where their fortitude comes from. The breakout star, potentially the key player from Mexico to look out for, in my opinion, is Irving Lozano. Irving Lozano, Chucky as they call him, he's only 22 years old. He plays for PSV Eindhoven in the Dutch Eredivisie. He could play the most crucial role in Mexico's attacking goal-scoring prowess up front to get them through the group stage. If Mexico's going to come through this group, I think he has to have a great tournament. And Mexico is going to have to put away most of their chances that come to them, because you see how Sweden played in qualifying. They're going to put numbers behind the ball. They're going to play a more pragmatic defensive style because they're not a very talented Swedish team. They just have a better manager than Mexico does. And that's because of Osorio that I'm worried about Mexico this summer. They don't look particularly stable heading into this tournament. And they could be primed to have their streak broken if they're not careful.